I have till midnight to remarry, or they kill me. That's the desperate cry of a widow, standing in the dusty saloon with every eye fixed on her. The church bell tolls, the cattle baron's riders rattle their spurs, and time is running out. She turns to the one man no one expected, the giant mountain drifter by the stove. He never wanted a family, never wanted to stay. But now, a vow before God may be the only thing keeping her and 2 children alive. Yet marriage is just the beginning. A hidden deed, a stolen spring, and a fire in the night reveal that this midnight bargain holds secrets deeper than death. And as the law, the railroad, and the baron close in, will this desperate marriage save them all, or destroy them before sunrise? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. Susan McGraw's boots clicked against the wooden planks of the boardwalk as she hurried to lock up her small mercantile store. The setting sun cast long shadows across Main Street, painting the Colorado town in shades of amber and dusty rose. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned the key in the lock, her mind already on the 2 children waiting for her at home. The clip-clop of approaching horses made her pause. Her heart skipped a beat as 3 riders emerged from the gathering dusk, their forms backlit by the sinking sun. The lead horse, a massive black stallion, carried a man she recognized all too well, one of Asa Holt's enforcers. "Evening, Ms. McGraw," the rider drawled, touching the brim of his hat with mock politeness. Dust coated his denim jacket, and his spurs jingled as he shifted in his saddle. "Got a message from Mr. Holt." Susan clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I've nothing to discuss with Mr. Holt." The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "That ain't exactly true, ma'am. See, Mr. Holt's got papers showing your late husband borrowed heavy against the ranch. Those debts come due at midnight." "That's impossible," Susan whispered, though fear gripped her heart. "Thomas never borrowed from Holt." "Papers say different." The rider leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping low. "But Mr. Holt's a reasonable man. Says if you was to marry before midnight, proper and legal-like, he'd consider them debts settled." "And if I refuse?" The words barely made it past Susan's dry throat. The second rider shifted his coat, revealing the gleam of a holstered pistol. "Then we'll be paying you another visit after midnight. Won't be as friendly neither." Susan's legs felt weak, but she forced herself to stand straight. "You tell Mr. Holt. I'll not be bullied." "Midnight, Ms. McGraw." The lead rider touched his hat again. "Choose wise, for them orphans' sake." The riders wheeled their horses around and melted back into the growing darkness, leaving Susan alone with her racing thoughts. The threat hung in the air like the evening dust, choking and inescapable. She hurried home, her skirts swishing against her ankles as she practically ran down the dirt road leading to her modest ranch house. The warm lights from the windows offered little comfort tonight, though the sight of 10-year-old Mary and 8-year-old James peering out at her approach squeezed her heart with fierce love. "Aunt Susan!" Mary called out as she opened the door. The girl's face, so like her mother's, was bright with welcome. "We saved you some stew." James looked up from his primer, ink smudged on his fingers. "I did all my sums, just like you asked." Susan forced a smile, hanging her shawl on its peg. The familiar scents of beef stew and fresh bread usually brought comfort, but tonight her stomach churned with worry. These children, her sister's precious gifts, depended on her entirely. She'd promised Sarah on her deathbed that she'd raise them as her own, give them a good life. "Come here, my loves," she said, gathering them close. They smelled of soap and sunshine, and she said a silent prayer of thanks for their presence in her life. Then she led them to the table, where 3 bowls of stew waited. "Let's say grace," Susan murmured, bowing her head. Her voice quavered as she prayed, "Dear Lord, guide us through darkness into light. Grant us wisdom in times of trouble, and protect those who cannot protect themselves. Amen." The children dug into their meals, but Susan barely touched hers. Her mind raced with possibilities, each more desperate than the last. Holt's threat was no idle one. She'd seen what happened to other small ranchers who stood in his way. The cattle baron's greed for land and water rights had already driven 3 families from the valley this year alone. After the dishes were cleared and the children tucked into bed, Susan sank into a rocking chair by the fireplace. She pulled her Bible into her lap, its worn leather familiar under her fingers. The pages fell open to Psalms, and tears blurred her vision as she read. "The Lord is my shepherd," she whispered, but the words brought little comfort tonight. Her gaze drifted to the mantel, where a daguerreotype showed her sister's family in happier times. Sarah's smile, forever frozen in time, seemed to remind Susan of her sacred promise. The clock on the wall ticked steadily toward 9 in the evening. 3 hours until midnight. 3 hours to find a solution that would save her land, her life, and most importantly, her children's future. Susan rose from her chair. Decision made. She couldn't sit here and wait for fate to claim them all. She needed help, and she needed it now. The town might be small, but surely someone would stand against Holt's tyranny. She checked on the children one last time, their peaceful faces illuminated by moonlight streaming through the window. Mary had kicked off her quilt as usual, and Susan gently tucked it back around her shoulders. James clutched his wooden horse, a last gift from his father, even in sleep. "I'll keep you safe," she whispered to them, "whatever it takes." Returning to the kitchen, Susan wrote a quick note in case they woke. "Gone to town on urgent business. Stay inside. Back soon. Love, Aunt Susan." She placed it prominently on the table, then retrieved her husband's old revolver from its hiding place in the flour bin. The weight of it was unfamiliar in her hands, but its presence gave her a measure of courage. The night air had grown cool when Susan stepped onto her porch. Stars scattered across the vast Colorado sky like diamond dust, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. She offered up one more prayer, this one wordless but heartfelt, then set out for town with determination in her stride. Time was running out, but Susan McGraw refused to let fear paralyze her. She'd find help before midnight struck. She had to. The lives of those she loved most depended on it. As she walked down the moonlit road, her shadow stretched long before her, and the weight of her decision pressed heavy on her shoulders. But with each step, her resolve strengthened. Holt might have money and men with guns, but Susan had something stronger, a mother's love for her children and faith that the Lord would not abandon them in their hour of need. The evening lamps cast pools of yellow light along Main Street as Susan hurried past the telegraph office. Her heart pounded with each step, and her fingers kept brushing the cold metal of Thomas's revolver, hidden in the folds of her skirt. The sound of piano music and boisterous voices spilled from the Red River Saloon ahead. Susan paused at the batwing doors, her hands trembling. She had never entered a saloon before. Proper ladies didn't frequent such establishments, but desperate times called for desperate measures. Through the windows, she could see the crowded room, thick with tobacco smoke and the sharp smell of whiskey. Taking a deep breath, she pushed through the doors. The piano notes faltered, then stopped entirely. Conversations died mid-sentence as heads turned toward her. Susan felt the weight of every stare as she stood there, her black widow's dress marking her as clearly as a branded cattle. "Well, I'll be," someone whispered, breaking the silence. "That's Thomas McGraw's widow." Susan's eyes swept the room, searching desperately. Card players set down their hands. A barmaid stopped mid-stride, pitcher frozen in her grip. Then Susan saw him. Eric Cutter, the mountain man who rarely came to town except to trade furs and supplies. He sat alone in a corner, his massive frame making the wooden chair look like a child's seat. Even seated, Cutter was an imposing figure. His beard was thick and dark, touched with gray at the temples, and his buckskin jacket showed the wear of hard living in the mountains. But it was his eyes that held Susan's attention. Deep-set and watchful, they seemed to see right through her. "Mr. Cutter!" Susan called out, her voice cracking slightly. She took a step forward, then another. The crowd parted before her like water around a stone. "I must speak with you." Eric Cutter set down his tin cup slowly, his expression unreadable. He said nothing, but his silence wasn't unkind. He waited as Susan approached his table, her skirts rustling in the hushed room. "I need your help," Susan said, forcing the words past her dry throat. "I need you to marry me. Tonight. Before midnight." A glass shattered somewhere in the stunned silence that followed. Someone laughed nervously but was quickly hushed. Eric Cutter remained still, studying her face with those penetrating eyes. "Please," Susan continued, her voice dropping to nearly a whisper. "Asa Holt's men say they'll kill me if I'm not married by midnight. They claim Thomas owed debts, but it's lies. All lies to steal our land and water rights." The mountain man's jaw tightened at the mention of Holt's name. His massive hands, scarred from years of trapping and survival, curled into fists on the table. "They'll kill me," Susan said, and now tears threatened to fall. "And what then becomes of the children? My sister's little ones, who have no one else in this world but me?" The saloon had grown so quiet that the tick of the clock behind the bar seemed to echo. Susan could feel the eyes of every patron on her, could sense the mixture of pity and discomfort in their gazes. But she kept her focus on Eric Cutter, willing him to understand her desperation. Through the windows, she saw several of Holt's riders dismounting across the street. They didn't enter the saloon, but their presence was a clear reminder that time was running out. Susan's fingers clutched at Eric's sleeve, the rough buckskin warm under her touch. "I know it's mad, asking a stranger to marry me. But you're known as an honorable man, Mr. Cutter, and right now honor might be all that stands between my family and destruction." The mountain man's eyes flicked to the window, noting the riders outside. His expression darkened like storm clouds gathering over the peaks. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough, like granite against granite. "Ma'am," he said, "marriage ain't something to be entered into lightly." "I know that," Susan whispered. "Believe me, I know." Eric pushed his chair back and stood, his full height making Susan step back slightly. He towered over her, but somehow his presence felt protective rather than threatening. "Holt's been pushing folks too far," he said, each word measured carefully. "Using fear to grab land, threatening women and children." He shook his head slowly. "Ain't right." The clock chimed 10 times, making Susan jump. Less than 2 hours remained until midnight. Her fingers tightened on Eric's sleeve. "Mr. Cutter, Eric, please." The mountain man looked down at her hand on his arm, then back to her face. Something shifted in his expression, a softening around his eyes, a slight easing of the hard line of his mouth. "Reckon I ain't much of a husband material," he said quietly. "Been alone in the mountains too long. But if marriage is what's needed to keep you and them children safe," he straightened to his full height, "then I'll do it." A collective release of breath seemed to sweep through the saloon. Susan's knees nearly buckled with relief, and she had to steady herself against the table. "Thank you," she breathed. "Oh, thank you." "Someone fetch the preacher," called out Tom Bailey, the saloon keeper. "And witnesses?" The saloon erupted into activity. Several men hurried out to find Reverend Mitchell. Others began moving tables to create a space in the center of the room. The barmaid quickly cleared away empty glasses and bottles, while someone else found a clean tablecloth to serve as a makeshift altar cloth. Through the window, Susan saw Holt's riders conferring urgently. One mounted up and rode off, presumably to inform their employer. But they all knew the law. Once marriage vows were spoken before witnesses and a man of God, not even Asa Holt could undo them. Eric Cutter still stood beside her, a solid presence that somehow made her feel both safer and more uncertain. This man would be her husband in less than 2 hours, this stranger who lived in the wilderness and spoke barely 10 words at a time. "The children," Susan said suddenly, turning to him. "I should go explain." "I'll send Billy to fetch them," Tom Bailey interrupted, gesturing to his young stable boy. "Can't have you walking around alone with Holt's men about." Eric nodded in agreement. "The boy can bring them through the back way." They should be here for this. His consideration for the children's presence touched something in Susan's heart. She looked up at him, this man who was about to change his entire life to save hers, and saw not just the fearsome mountain man others spoke of, but something else, something that gave her hope. "Much obliged," Eric said to Tom Bailey, using the formal words as if they were unfamiliar in his mouth. Then he turned to Susan, his voice softening slightly. "Best wait in Tom's office till the preacher comes. More proper that way." Susan nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by the reality of what was about to happen. As Tom's wife Martha led her toward the back office, she glanced over her shoulder. Eric Cutter stood watching her go, his expression thoughtful and somehow gentle despite his fierce appearance. The clock ticked steadily onward toward midnight, each moment bringing them closer to a marriage born of necessity and desperation. But as Susan waited in the quiet office, listening to the bustling preparations beyond the door, she felt something beyond just relief at finding a solution. She felt hope, fragile as a mountain wildflower, but just as determined to bloom in harsh conditions. Through the office window, she could see the stars scattered across the night sky. The same stars that had witnessed her desperate walk into town would now witness her wedding. Susan closed her eyes and offered up a silent prayer, not just for safety now, but for the strength to face whatever tomorrow might bring. Reverend Mitchell arrived at the church still wearing his supper napkin, tucked absently into his collar. The evening air had grown cool as townspeople hurried through the darkened streets, carrying lanterns that cast dancing shadows on the weathered clapboard walls of the small church. Inside, the wooden pews creaked as people settled themselves, their whispers echoing in the humble space. Susan stood near the altar, her hands clasped tightly together to hide their trembling. The 2 brass rings Tom Bailey had found in his cash box felt heavy in her pocket. Eric Cutter's massive frame seemed to fill the front of the church as he stood beside her, his buckskin jacket exchanged for a clean but well-worn coat someone had lent him. He kept his eyes forward, his expression solemn, while behind them the murmurs grew louder. Marrying a mountain man of all things, and her not 6 months a widow. Holt's riders are still outside. The last whisper made Susan's shoulders tense. Through the church's windows, she could see the orange glow of cigarettes where Holt's men waited in the darkness. The clock in the church tower showed 15 minutes until 11. Time was slipping away like water through her fingers. Reverend Mitchell cleared his throat, silencing the gossip. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his voice gentle but firm, "we are gathered here tonight under unusual circumstances." Susan felt the weight of every stare. Her cheeks burned with shame, but she lifted her chin. "Reverend," she said, her voice quivering slightly, "I know this seems hasty and improper, but I must explain." The preacher nodded encouragingly. In the lamplight, his kind face showed no judgment. "My husband Thomas died owing no man anything," Susan continued, each word stronger than the last. "But Asa Holt claims otherwise. His men came to me today with threats, marry by midnight or forfeit everything, including my life." She took a shuddering breath. I have no choice but to wed again, to protect what's mine by right." A rustle of sympathy moved through the congregation. Several women dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. The men's faces grew dark with anger at such treatment of a widow. "Mr. Cutter," Reverend Mitchell turned to Eric, "you understand what you're undertaking here? Marriage is a sacred bond not to be entered into lightly." Eric's deep voice filled the church. "I understand, Reverend. This lady needs protection from those who'd harm her. I aim to provide it." He paused, then added firmly, "And I aim to do right by her, proper and legal, before God and these witnesses." Susan felt tears prick her eyes at the dignity he gave her with those words. This stranger was defending her honor, even as he agreed to this desperate arrangement. "Very well," the preacher said. He opened his Bible, its pages glowing golden in the lamplight. "Who gives this woman to be married?" Tom Bailey stepped forward. "I do, as friend to her late husband and representative of this community." The ceremony proceeded swiftly, but with all proper reverence. Susan's hands shook as she repeated the ancient vows, her voice barely above a whisper. Eric's responses came clear and steady, though she noticed his large hands trembled slightly as they exchanged the simple brass rings. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder," Reverend Mitchell proclaimed. "I now pronounce you." "Wait!" Susan burst out, tears suddenly streaming down her face. She turned to face the congregation, no longer able to contain her fear. "You all need to know the truth. It's not just me I'm protecting." Her voice broke. "My sister's children. They're at home right now, probably scared to death. They've no one else in the world but me. I promised her on her deathbed I'd care for them." Gasps and murmurs filled the church. Several women openly wept now. "But there's more," Susan continued, her words tumbling out. "Holt doesn't want our ranch for grazing. He wants it because it shelters the valley's only spring." She looked at the faces before her, seeing understanding dawn. "That spring feeds the creek that waters half the farms in the valley. If Holt controls it." The murmurs turned to outraged exclamations. Everyone knew what it would mean. Holt could charge what he wanted for water rights, or deny them completely. He could destroy every small farm and homestead in the valley. "That water belongs to everyone," someone shouted from the back. "It ain't right," another voice added. "Using orphans to steal water rights." Eric's hand found Susan's shoulder, steady and warm. She looked up at him through her tears and saw something fierce and protective in his eyes. He faced the congregation, his voice carrying to every corner of the church. "No man's going to harm this woman or those children," he declared, "and no one's going to steal water from honest folks who need it." His grip tightened slightly on Susan's shoulder. "That's a husband's promise before God and all of you." The church erupted in approval. Men stood up, offering their support. Women clustered around Susan, offering comfort and promises of help with the children. Through the windows, Susan saw Holt's riders mounting up, spurring their horses into the darkness. They would report to their boss that the marriage was legal and witnessed, but they would also tell him that the town now knew his true purpose. The fight for the spring was no longer just her burden to bear alone. Reverend Mitchell raised his hands for quiet. "Let us conclude this ceremony properly," he said, and turned back to the couple before him. "I now pronounce you man and wife." The words rang out in the church, binding and final. Susan felt the weight of her new ring, strange yet somehow comforting. Beside her stood her husband, a man she barely knew, yet one who had just sworn before God and their neighbors to protect her, her children, and the water that gave life to their valley. The clock struck 11 as the townspeople pressed forward to congratulate them. 1 hour of her deadline remained, but Susan no longer felt the same desperate fear. Something had changed in that small church, transformed by truth and shared purpose. She was no longer just a widow fighting alone. She was a wife again, with not only a husband but an entire community standing beside her. The church doors creaked open, releasing a stream of well-wishers into the cool night air. Lantern light spilled across the wooden steps as Susan and Eric emerged, their shadows stretching long against the weathered boards. The townsfolk's voices still echoed with support and congratulations, but their warmth was quickly chilled by a sharp voice cutting through the darkness. Mrs. McGraw, or should I say, Mrs. Cutter now. A man in an Eastern-cut suit stepped forward, his polished boots incongruous on the dusty street. The moonlight caught the gleam of his wire-rimmed spectacles as he withdrew a leather document case from beneath his arm. I'm Harrison Wells, representing the Western Pacific Railroad Company. He adjusted his spectacles with precise movements. And I'm afraid I have some rather urgent business regarding your property. Susan's fingers tightened on Eric's arm. From the shadows across the street came the sound of horses shifting, and she glimpsed Asa Holt's satisfied smile in the glow of his cigar. What business? Eric's deep voice carried a warning note. Wells cleared his throat. The railroad requires clear proof of deed ownership by sunrise, or the land will be subject to immediate seizure for track expansion. He extended a sheaf of papers that rustled in the evening breeze. Federal law grants certain powers when it comes to transportation infrastructure. You understand? Susan's knees weakened. But that's impossible. Sunrise is only hours away. Indeed. Wells's tone was professionally sympathetic. However, the law is quite clear. Without proper documentation of ownership, the land reverts to federal control for public use. From his shadowed vantage point, Holt's laugh carried across the street. Ain't that a shame, Mrs. Cutter? Seems like your rushed wedding won't help you after all. Eric took a step toward Holt, but Susan clutched his arm tighter. The children, she whispered. We need to get back to them. The walk home was tense and silent. Susan's mind raced, trying to remember where Thomas might have stored important papers. The night had grown colder, and she pulled her shawl closer as they hurried along the rutted road. Behind them, the town's lights gradually faded, leaving only starlight to guide their way. The small ranch house came into view, a single lamp burning in the window where Mrs. Peterson, their elderly neighbor, had stayed with the children. As they approached, the door flew open. Two small figures burst out, running towards Susan. Aunt Susan! You were gone so long! 8-year-old Mary's voice quavered with relief. Her 6-year-old brother James clung to Susan's skirts, his eyes wide as he stared up at Eric's towering form. Susan knelt, gathering them close. I'm sorry I worried you, darlings. She smoothed Mary's dark hair, so like her mother's had been. There's someone I want you to meet. She turned toward Eric, who had hung back uncertainly. This is Mr. Cutter. Eric, he's... She swallowed hard. He's going to be protecting us now. James pressed closer to her side. Like a soldier? Eric's weathered face softened as he crouched down to the boy's level. Something like that, son. I aim to keep you and your sister and your aunt safe. Mary's chin lifted. Are you staying here? With us? Yes, he is, Susan answered, seeing Eric's gentle handling of the children's fears. We were married tonight, in town. Both children stared at her in shock. Mrs. Peterson appeared in the doorway, her lined face concerned. There's soup keeping warm on the stove, Susan. Not much, but... It's perfect, thank you. Susan ushered the children inside, while Eric thanked Mrs. Peterson and saw her safely started on her way home. The kitchen was warm from the cook stove, the familiar scents of bone broth and biscuits filling the small space. Susan ladled soup into 4 bowls while the children peppered her with questions. Eric sat quietly at the table, his large frame making the furniture seem smaller than usual. But why didn't you tell us? Mary asked, pushing her spoon through the thin soup. Why didn't we get to come to the wedding? Susan's hands trembled as she set down her spoon. Sometimes, sweetheart, grown-ups have to make quick decisions to keep everyone safe. She glanced at Eric, finding unexpected support in his steady gaze. There are some bad men who want to take our land away from us. James's eyes grew round. The spring, too? But that's where we get our water. That's right. Eric's deep voice was gentle but firm. Your aunt is very brave, protecting that spring for everyone who needs it, and now I'm here to help her. Susan felt tears threatening again at his words. He could have simply said he was fulfilling a bargain, but instead he gave her actions meaning and worth before the children. The meager supper was soon finished. Susan tucked the children into their small bedroom, soothing their lingering fears with promises that Eric would keep watch through the night. When she returned to the kitchen, she found him spreading his bedroll near the door. I'm sorry it's not much of a wedding feast, she said softly, gathering the bowls. Or much of anything else. Eric straightened, his expression serious. You don't need to apologize. But we do need to talk about those papers the railroad man wants. Susan sank into a chair, the weight of that new threat crashing back over her. Thomas kept important documents in his old trunk, but I haven't opened it since. She pressed her fingers to her temples. Everything happened so fast when he got sick, then with my sister passing and the children coming. We'll start looking now. Eric's voice was calm, practical. There's still a few hours until sunrise. They worked by lamplight, carefully going through Thomas's trunk. Susan's throat tightened at each familiar item, his Sunday shirt, carefully folded letters, a daguerreotype of their wedding day. But no deed. Think, Susan, Eric urged gently. Would he have kept it somewhere else? Somewhere safer? She closed her eyes, trying to remember. He always said our home was built on solid ground. Her eyes flew open. The foundation! There's a loose stone in the root cellar. He used to hide valuable papers there during the war. Eric was already reaching for the lamp. Together they descended the narrow stairs to the cellar, the earthen walls close around them. Susan pointed to a corner where the foundation stones were visible. That one, the one with the chip in the corner. Eric set down the lamp and worked the stone free. Behind it was a small space, and within it, wrapped in oilcloth, a packet of papers. Susan's hands shook as she unfolded them. The deed, she whispered, and the water rights grant from the territorial governor. Both with proper seals and witnesses. Relief made her legs weak. Eric's hand settled on her shoulder, strong and reassuring. We'll take them to that lawyer at first light. No one's taking your land now. They climbed back to the kitchen, where Eric resumed his place by the door. Susan paused in her own doorway, looking back at him. Thank you, she said softly. For everything today? He nodded, his expression grave in the lamplight. Get some rest, Susan. Tomorrow's soon enough to face whatever comes next. She slipped into her room, holding the precious papers close. Through the thin walls, she could hear Eric moving quietly, checking windows and doors. Strange to have a man in the house again, a husband she barely knew, yet somehow his presence brought both comfort and confusion to her troubled heart. In the dark, Susan listened to the familiar sounds of her home, the children's soft breathing from the next room, the creak of floorboards under Eric's careful tread, the distant yip of coyotes across the valley. So much had changed since morning, yet the night's gentle rhythms remained the same. She clutched her pillow, wondering what the sunrise would bring, and prayed for strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The first pale light of dawn crept over the mountain peaks, painting the frost-covered grass in shades of silver. Eric was already up, his bedroll neatly stowed by the door. Through the window, Susan watched him moving purposefully around the barn, his broad shoulders hunched against the morning chill. She stirred the cooking fire back to life, trying to quiet the flutter of nerves in her stomach. Having a man in the house again felt strange, even stranger that it was this quiet giant who'd been little more than a shadow in town before yesterday. "Aunt Susan?" Mary appeared in her nightgown, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Is Mr. Cutter still here?" "Yes, dear. He's seeing to the animals." Susan pulled her niece close, breathing in the familiar scent of soap and sleep-warmed hair. "Let's get you and your brother dressed. There's work to be done." By the time the children were fed and bundled against the cold, Eric had returned with 2 brimming water buckets. He set them carefully by the sink, nodding to Susan. "Stock's fed. That old mare of yours seems partial to early morning attention." "Thank you." Susan handed him a cup of coffee, noting how careful he was not to brush her fingers as he took it. "I usually struggle with those heavy buckets." "No need for that now." His voice was gruff but gentle. He glanced at the children, who were watching him with undisguised curiosity. "Reckon there's plenty else needs doing around here?" As if to prove his point, a crash from outside drew their attention. Susan hurried to the window to see one of the fence rails had finally given way, letting the chickens scatter toward freedom. "Oh no," she sighed. "That rail's been threatening to fall for weeks. I just haven't had time to." But Eric was already moving, setting down his coffee. "Got any spare lumber?" "Behind the barn. But you don't have to. Best get to it before those hens wander too far." He pulled on his coat, then paused. "James, want to help me round up some chickens?" The boy's face lit up. He looked to Susan for permission, then scampered after Eric's long strides. Mary hung back, watching through the window as her brother helped Eric herd the escaped chickens back toward the coop. Susan's hand stilled in the dishwater as she watched Eric work. His movements were sure and efficient as he replaced the broken rail, taking time to show James how to hold the boards steady. When a hawk's shadow passed overhead, he immediately positioned himself between the bird and the nervous chickens, his presence enough to discourage the predator. "He's nice," Mary said quietly. "Not scary like he looks in town." Susan squeezed her niece's shoulder. "No, he's not scary at all." By afternoon, the fence was mended, the chickens secured, and the morning's work complete. Susan changed into her best dress, the dark blue one she kept for church, and prepared to ride into town. The children would stay with Mrs. Peterson while she and Eric visited the notary's office. The ride was mostly silent, but not uncomfortable. Eric kept his horse close to hers, scanning the horizon with watchful eyes. As they approached town, Susan felt the weight of stares from the boardwalk. Some folks, like old Mr. Henderson from the feed store, tipped their hats respectfully. Others turned away, whispering behind their hands. "Did you hear? She trapped that mountain man into marriage." Desperate times call for desperate measures, I suppose. What kind of woman would... Eric's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, helping Susan dismount in front of the notary's office. Inside, Mr. Parker greeted them with professional courtesy, though his eyebrows rose at their request to search through Thomas McGraw's old papers. "Of course, Mrs. Cutter now, isn't it?" He adjusted his spectacles. "Though I'm not sure what you expect to find. Most of your late husband's affairs were settled years ago." "We need to locate the original deed," Susan explained. "There's some question about the land's status with the railroad coming through." Mr. Parker nodded slowly. "Well, you're welcome to look. The McGraw files are in that cabinet there, though mind you don't disturb the ordering." They spent hours going through dusty folders and faded documents. Susan's eyes grew tired from squinting at Thomas's cramped handwriting. Just when she was ready to give up, Eric made a sound of interest. "Look here." He pointed to an entry in one of the ledgers. Reference to a treaty-bound land deed dated 1862. Says it was witnessed by both territory officials and tribal leaders. Susan leaned closer. Yes, I remember Thomas mentioning something about that. The spring was considered sacred ground by the local tribes. They only agreed to its use if it remained open to all. But the actual deed isn't here. Eric carefully turned another page. Just the reference. Susan's heart sank. Without that document, we'll find it. Eric's voice held quiet conviction. This gives us something to work with, at least. The sun was lowering when they finally left the notary's office. Susan suggested stopping by the church to update Reverend Matthews on their search. The small white building was cool and quiet inside, smelling of beeswax and old hymnals. The preacher looked up from his Bible as they entered. "Ah, our newlyweds. How goes the search?" Susan explained what they'd found, and hadn't found, while Eric stood silent beside her, his hat in his hands. When she finished, Reverend Matthews nodded thoughtfully. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he said gently. "Perhaps this marriage, rushed though it may have been, is part of His plan to protect not just your family, Susan, but the water rights that serve so many. But without that deed, have faith." The preacher smiled. "God's providence often appears just when we need it most. Keep searching, keep praying, and trust that you've been brought together for a purpose." On the ride home, Susan pondered the preacher's words. She glanced at Eric, who rode beside her with the same quiet strength he'd shown all day. He'd proved himself more than capable, more than willing to help with the daily tasks she'd struggled with alone. More than that, he'd shown genuine kindness to the children, patience with their questions, gentleness with their fears. As if sensing her thoughts, he turned to meet her gaze. "We'll figure this out, Susan. One way or another." She nodded, surprised to find she believed him. Whatever tomorrow might bring, she was no longer facing it alone. The setting sun painted the mountains in deep purple and gold as they rode home to collect the children. Another day gone, but not without progress, not without hope. The sun had dipped behind the mountains by the time Eric and Susan returned to the ranch with the children. Purple shadows stretched across the yard, and a cool breeze rustled through the cottonwoods. Susan's arms were full of groceries from their stop at the mercantile, while Eric carried a heavy sack of flour over one shoulder. "Smells like rain coming," Eric said, lifting his nose to the wind. "Might get some weather tonight." Inside the kitchen, lamplight cast a warm glow as Susan began preparing supper. The children helped set the table while Eric brought in more firewood, stacking it neatly by the stove. The simple routine felt almost normal, though Susan's hands trembled slightly as she kneaded dough for biscuits. "Can I help?" Mary asked, standing on tiptoe to peer at the dough. "You can cut them out," Susan smiled, handing her niece the tin biscuit cutter. "Just like your mama taught you." The words slipped out before she could stop them. A heavy silence fell over the kitchen. James stopped arranging the forks and spoons, his lower lip trembling. "I miss Mama," he whispered. Susan wiped her hands on her apron and drew both children close. "I know, sweetheart. I miss her too." She looked up to find Eric watching them, his expression gentle beneath his beard. "Why don't you tell me about her?" he asked quietly, settling into a chair by the stove. "Your mama must have been something special." The children looked to Susan, who nodded encouragement. Mary spoke first, her voice soft but steady. "She made the best apple pies. And she could sing so pretty, like a bird." She twisted the hem of her dress. "She got sick last winter. The doctor came, but..." "Nothing helped," Susan finished, running a hand over Mary's hair. "My sister Sarah was always the stronger one of us. When the fever took her, She swallowed hard. "I promised her I'd look after her babies. They're all I have left of her now." Eric nodded slowly. "A promise like that, it's sacred. Nothing more important than keeping faith with family." "Did you have a family, Mr. Cutter?" James asked, curiosity overtaking his usual shyness. A shadow crossed Eric's weathered face. He stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. Had brothers once. Lost them in the war, all three of them. The war between the states? Susan asked softly. Eric nodded. Served with the Union. 19th Infantry. His voice grew distant. Lost more than brothers out there. Lost my faith, too, for a spell. Couldn't reckon how God could let such things happen. He glanced at the children's wide eyes and managed a small smile. That's partly why I took to the mountains after. Seemed simpler up there. Just me and the wilderness. Were you scared? In the mountains? James scooted his chair closer, fascinated. Sometimes, Eric admitted, nature demands respect. But I learned her ways. Tracking, hunting, reading weather. Found a kind of peace up there I couldn't find nowhere else. Could you teach me? James asked eagerly. About tracking and stuff? James, Susan started to object, but Eric held up a hand. I'd be honored to teach you, young man. Your mama willing? He met Susan's eyes. Every boy should know how to read sign and handle himself outdoors. Might come in handy someday. Susan nodded slowly, touched by the careful way he'd asked her permission. As long as you're careful with him. Promise. Eric's expression grew serious as he turned back to James. First lesson. Respect. For the land, the animals, and especially your elders. That includes your aunt. James nodded solemnly. Yes, sir. The biscuits were browning nicely now, their scent mixing with the savory stew bubbling on the stove. Mary helped Susan ladle portions into bowls, while James proudly carried the biscuit basket to the table. For a moment, Susan's throat tightened at how natural it felt, this impromptu family gathered around her table. Eric bowed his head as Susan said, "Grace," though she noticed he didn't join in the "Amen." Still, he waited politely until she finished before picking up his spoon. The meal passed pleasantly, with the children pepper Eric with questions about mountain life. Did you see bears? Mary asked, dunking her biscuit in her stew. Many times. Learned to keep my distance and store my food proper. Eric's eyes crinkled. Though once I did have to spend a night up a tree when a particularly curious grizzly took a shine to my camp. The children giggled at his description of waiting out the bear, and even Susan found herself smiling. Eric was a natural storyteller, she realized when he chose to speak. His deep voice rose and fell with the rhythm of the tale, drawing his listeners in. After supper, while Susan supervised the children's bedtime preparations, Eric stepped outside to check the animals one last time. The night air was crisp, stars pricking through gaps in the gathering clouds. His rifle rested comfortably in the crook of his arm as he made his rounds. The barn was secure, horses settled in their stalls. The chicken coop was latched tight against nocturnal predators. Eric paused by the corral fence, listening to the night sounds, the whisper of wind in the grass, the distant yip of coyotes, the creak of the windmill. Footsteps behind him made him turn. Susan approached, wrapped in a shawl against the evening chill. The children are in bed, she said softly. They insisted on saying goodnight to you first, but I told them you were busy with your rounds. I'll look in on them before they sleep, Eric promised. Make sure they know they're safe. Susan studied his profile in the starlight. You're good with them? I didn't expect. Didn't expect a rough mountain man to have a gentle touch? His smile held no bitterness. The wild teaches you patience. And children ain't so different from young animals sometimes. They need steady handling and a soft voice. I've been so afraid, Susan admitted, trying to raise them right, protect them, keep the ranch going. Some days it feels impossible. You're not alone anymore. Eric's voice was firm. I may not be the husband you would have chosen, given time and proper courting. But I swear to you, I'll do right by you and those children. He shifted his rifle, scanning the darkness beyond the fence. I lost one family to violence, lost my faith along with them, but maybe— He paused, choosing his words carefully. Maybe the good Lord ain't finished with me yet. Maybe this is my chance to make things right, to protect instead of destroy. Susan touched his arm lightly. Thank you for understanding about the children, about Sarah. Eric nodded. Get some rest. I'll keep watch a while longer. Susan returned to the house, leaving Eric to his patrol. He walked the perimeter of the ranch yard, rifle ready, eyes alert for any movement in the shadows. The last light in the house went dark, but a lamp still burned in the front window, a beacon in the night. Eric settled onto the porch steps, his back against a post. Above him, clouds scudded across the face of the moon, and the wind carried the promise of rain. He thought of the small faces that had looked at him with such trust over supper, of Susan's quiet strength in the face of loss. Lord, he whispered, the word feeling strange after so long. If you're still listening to the likes of me, help me keep them safe. Help me be worthy of their trust. The night deepened around him as he kept his vigil, rifle across his knees, guarding his newfound family's sleep. Dawn painted the Colorado sky in soft pinks and golds as Eric saddled 2 horses. Susan emerged from the house, dressed in her best riding skirt, her hair neatly pinned beneath a modest bonnet. She had arranged for Mrs. Peterson next door to watch the children while they rode into town. The preacher's usually in his study early, Susan said, accepting Eric's help onto her mare. He's been keeping church records since before I came to the valley. Eric swung into his own saddle, adjusting his rifle in its scabbard. Let's pray he remembers something about that deed. They rode side by side down the dusty road, the morning air still crisp with lingering night chill. Susan noticed how Eric's eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, alert for any sign of trouble. His protective instincts, honed by years in the wilderness, had already become a comfort to her. The church stood quiet in the morning light, its whitewashed walls gleaming. As they dismounted and tied their horses, Susan spotted movement in the shadows across the street. 2 of Holt's riders lounged against a hitching post, watching them with predatory interest. Eric placed a steady hand at the small of her back as they climbed the church steps. Pay them no mind, he murmured. We're here on honest business. They found Preacher Matthews in his study, surrounded by leather-bound books and stacks of yellowed papers. His weathered face brightened at their entrance. Susan, Eric, come in, come in. He cleared space on his desk. I've been thinking about your situation since the wedding. Something's been nagging at my memory. Susan leaned forward eagerly. About the deed? Yes, indeed. The preacher rifled through a drawer. I clearly remember your Joshua bringing it to me, must be 6 or 7 years ago now. Wanted it filed properly with the church records, seeing as how the land grant had ties to the old mission boundaries. Do you still have it? Eric asked. Matthews frowned. That's what's troubling me. I know I made a copy for safekeeping, but I can't seem to locate it. He gestured at the cramped room. I've been searching since yesterday, but these records, well, organization has never been my strong suit. Through the window, Susan saw more of Holt's men gathering across the street. Her hands twisted nervously in her lap. Is there anywhere else it might be? Eric's voice remained calm, but his shoulders tensed at the growing crowd outside. Well now, the preacher stroked his chin. I did sometimes store important documents at the general store. Mr. Wilson has a proper safe, you see. Better protection than my rickety old cabinet. Then that's our next stop, Eric said, standing. Much obliged for your help, preacher. Outside, the morning had grown warmer, and more townspeople filled the streets. Susan felt the weight of their stares as she and Eric walked toward the general store. Whispers followed them, some sympathetic, others suspicious of their hasty marriage. Holt's men trailed behind at a distance, making no secret of their surveillance. As Eric and Susan approached Wilson's store, One of the riders spurred his horse forward, cutting them off. "Ain't it sweet?" he sneered. "The widow and her mountain man out for a morning stroll." His hand rested meaningfully on his holstered pistol. Eric stepped slightly in front of Susan, his voice low and steady. "Move aside, friend. We've got business to attend to." The rider's face darkened. "Mister, Holt's got business too. Shame if anything happened to delay it." A tense silence fell over the street. Susan held her breath, seeing other hands drift toward weapons. But Eric simply smiled, a cold, dangerous expression that reminded her of his years in the wild. "That would be a shame," he agreed quietly, "especially since the law's awful particular about interference with church business." He nodded toward the preacher's study. "Might make folks question where certain loyalties lie." The rider's eyes flickered toward the church, then to the growing crowd of townspeople. After a long moment, he reined his horse aside. "Much obliged," Eric said pleasantly, guiding Susan past. Inside Wilson's store, the owner looked up nervously from his ledger. "Mrs. McGraw, Mrs. Cutter now, I suppose. What can I do for you?" "The preacher thinks you might have some papers in your safe," Susan explained. "A copy of our land deed, filed some years back." Wilson's face grew troubled. I'm not sure I should get involved. Mr. Holt was very specific about..." "About what?" Eric's quiet question carried clear across the store. The shopkeeper wouldn't meet their eyes. "He said anyone helping you would regret it. Said accidents happen to troublemakers." Susan saw then how far Holt's influence reached, how thoroughly fear had infected the town. Her neighbors, good people she'd known for years, were too frightened to stand against him. "Mr. Wilson." She stepped forward. "That spring on our land doesn't just water our stock. It feeds half the small farms in the valley, if Holt takes it." "I'm sorry." Wilson's voice shook. "I truly am. But I have my family to think about." They left the store empty-handed, the taste of defeat bitter in Susan's mouth. The sun had climbed higher, baking the dusty street. Holt's men still watched from the shadows, but made no move to stop them as they retrieved their horses. The ride home was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. As they approached the ranch, Susan spotted a rider waiting by the gate, a lean figure on a paint horse. "Henry," she breathed in relief, recognizing the half-Apache scout who often helped the preacher with his mission work. Henry straightened as they approached, his dark eyes serious beneath the brim of his hat. He exchanged silent nods with Eric before turning to Susan. "The preacher sent word you might need a friend," he said simply. They gathered around the kitchen table, while the children played outside under Mrs. Peterson's watchful eye. Henry accepted a cup of coffee, wrapping his weathered hands around the warm tin. "Holt's men have been asking questions at the reservation," he said without preamble. "About the old mission boundaries, water rights from before the treaties." "Why?" Susan asked. "He's building a case to claim the spring was never legally transferred." Henry's voice was grim. "But that's not what worries me. His riders have been gathering, more coming in every day. They're camping in the box canyon north of town." Eric's face hardened. "How many?" 20, maybe more. Well armed." Henry sipped his coffee. "They're waiting for something. My guess is they'll move soon, papers or no papers." "But that would be robbery," Susan protested. "The Law's slow to reach these parts," Henry reminded her. "By the time a marshal could arrive, it would be too late." He set his cup down carefully. "Holt wants that spring, and he means to have it, one way or another." Susan felt the weight of his words settle over the kitchen. Outside, she could hear the children's laughter, the peaceful sounds of the ranch, all of it suddenly fragile, threatened. "We need that deed," she whispered. Henry nodded. "The preacher's still searching his records. And I have friends at the reservation who remember the old boundaries. But time is short. He stood, settling his hat back on his head. I'll keep watching Holt's camp, try to give warning if they move. At the door, he paused. Be careful. Both of you. Holt's not a man to let anything stand in his way. Not law, not justice, and certainly not mercy. They watched him ride away, his paint horse blending into the evening shadows. Eric's hand found Susan's shoulder, steady and reassuring. We'll find the proof, he promised quietly. And if we don't, his jaw set firmly. Well, I didn't survive those mountains by backing down from a fight. Susan covered his hand with her own, drawing strength from his touch. Beyond the fence, the spring burbled its endless song, life-giving water that had sustained generations. She prayed it wouldn't become the cause of bloodshed. As darkness gathered, the first stars appearing in the purple sky, Henry's warning echoed in her mind. Holt would stop at nothing to take the spring. The question was, how far would they go to protect it? Dawn painted the Colorado sky in streaks of amber and rose as Eric stepped onto the front porch. The worn planks creaked beneath his boots while he surveyed the ranch in the growing light. His experienced eye caught fresh damage that made his jaw tighten. Posts torn from the ground, a water trough kicked over, tracks from multiple horses stamped into the mud. Inside, he heard Susan stirring, the quiet sounds of breakfast preparations mixing with the children's sleepy voices. The domesticity of it tugged at something deep in his chest, a longing he'd thought long buried in mountain solitude. He was already hauling tools from the barn when Susan emerged, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the morning chill. She carried 2 tin cups of steaming coffee. I saw the fences, she said quietly, offering him a cup. They must have come in the night. Eric nodded, wrapping his calloused hands around the warm metal. Holt's way of showing what he can do. Testing us, most likely. Will you need help with the repairs? No. He smiled slightly. You tend to the young ones. I've mended worse in harder places. The sun climbed higher as Eric worked, sweat darkening his shirt despite the cool air. He replaced 3 fence posts, tamping the earth firm around each one, then wrestled the heavy water trough back into position. The work was familiar, almost peaceful, though his eyes constantly scanned the surrounding hills for riders. Near midday, the children ventured out to watch him work. The boy, Tommy, helped gather smaller pieces of wood, while his sister Sarah perched on a nearby rail, swinging her legs. Their presence made Eric acutely aware of how much was at stake, not just land and water rights, but the safety of this makeshift family he'd suddenly acquired. Inside the house, Susan sat at the kitchen table, pen scratching across paper as she composed her letter to Washington. The words came slowly, each one weighted with the desperate need for help. To whom it may concern, she wrote, I write regarding deed confirmation for the McGraw Ranch property, containing the primary water source for our valley. Recent challenges to ownership require immediate verification. She paused, watching through the window as Eric showed Tommy how to properly stack kindling. The sight warmed her heart, even as worry gnawed at her stomach. The letter would take weeks to reach Washington, longer still for any response. They needed more immediate solutions. The afternoon wore on. Eric finished the major repairs, though he knew Holt's men might return to undo his work any night. His muscles ached pleasantly from honest labor, so different from his solitary trapping days. As shadows lengthened across the yard, he found himself watching Susan through the kitchen window, admiring her gentle way with the children, her quiet strength in the face of threat. When sunset painted the mountains purple and gold, Susan called them all in to supper. The table was set simply. Fresh bread she'd baked that morning, beans, and the last of the autumn preserves. The children settled into their chairs, looking expectantly at Eric. Shall we pray? Susan asked softly, reaching for his hand across the table. Eric hesitated. Prayer had been foreign to him since the war, since watching friends die with prayers on their lips. but Susan's fingers were warm against his palm, and the children's faces shone with innocent trust. He cleared his throat. It's been a while. That's all right, Susan whispered. God hears even rusty prayers. Tommy took his other hand, completing the circle. Eric bowed his head, feeling the unfamiliar vulnerability of sharing faith with others. Lord, Susan began, her voice steady and clear, we thank you for this food, for safety through another day. We ask your blessing on our home and protection for those who shelter here. Guide us in these troubled times and help us trust in your provision. Amen, the children chorused. Eric's amen came rougher, but genuine. Something shifted in his chest, not a dramatic conversion, but a quiet awakening, like spring thaw in high country. They broke bread together, passing the simple dishes around the table. The children chattered about their day, Tommy proud of his wood-gathering help, Sarah describing a nest of baby rabbits she'd found near the garden. Eric found himself drawn into their conversation, answering questions about mountain life, telling carefully edited stories of his trapping days. Susan watched him with her family, noting how his gruff manner gentled around the children. She saw hints of the man he might have been before war, and loss carved harder edges into him. The man he might become again, with time and trust. After the dishes were cleared and the children tucked into bed, Susan and Eric sat by the fireplace. The flames painted shifting patterns on the walls while crickets sang their evening chorus outside. Thank you, Susan said quietly, for joining us in prayer. I know it wasn't easy. Eric studied the fire. Been a long time since I felt worthy of asking anything from God. Maybe that's exactly when we need prayer most. She touched his arm gently. When we're lost, when we feel unworthy, that's when faith matters most. He turned to look at her, firelight reflecting in his eyes. You really believe that? After everything you've lost? I have to. Her voice was soft but certain. Faith carried me through my husband's death, my sister's passing. It gives me strength to keep my promise to those children. And now? She met his gaze steadily. Now it tells me that maybe this marriage, however it started, wasn't just desperation. Maybe it was providence. Eric covered her hand with his own, rough fingers gentle against her skin. They sat in companionable silence, watching the flames dance lower. The moment felt tender, new, like spring's first flower pushing through mountain snow. Outside, a coyote called lonely into the night. The sound reminded them of dangers still lurking, of battles yet to come. But here in the firelight, sharing warmth and tentative faith, they found a fragment of peace. Not a dramatic transformation, but a quiet beginning, like dawn breaking over distant peaks, promising light after long darkness. Sarah's voice drifted from the children's room, singing a hymn Susan had taught her. The simple melody wrapped around them, a reminder of innocence worth protecting, of faith worth reclaiming. Eric's hand tightened slightly on Susan's, and she leaned into his strength, grateful for this moment of grace amid uncertainty. The fire burned low, but neither moved to stoke it. Sometimes the greatest changes come in stillness, in shared silence and simple trust. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they had bread, prayer, and the first fragile blooming of hope between them. Morning sunlight streamed through the notary's dusty windows as Eric and Susan stood before the massive oak desk. Mr. Peterson, the elderly notary, adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles while rifling through stacks of yellowed papers. I remember that chest, he muttered, pointing to a heavy iron-bound box in the corner. James McGraw always kept his important papers locked away in there. Never did find the key after he passed. Susan's fingers twisted in her shawl. That's where the deed might be? Eric studied the sturdy lock, running his thumb over the keyhole. Reckon I could open it, if you'll permit me, Mr. Peterson. The notary hesitated, then nodded. Given the circumstances and seeing as you're Mrs. McGraw's husband now. He gestured toward the chest. Do what you must. Eric knelt before the box, pulling a set of worn tools from his coat pocket. Years of trapping had taught him more than just hunting skills. His large hands moved with surprising delicacy as he worked at the lock. Susan watched, hardly daring to breathe. Outside, wagon wheels creaked past on the street, and somewhere a child laughed. The ordinary sounds of town life seemed far away from this moment of desperate hope. There, Eric murmured as the lock clicked open. He lifted the heavy lid carefully. Inside, packets of papers lay bundled with faded ribbon. Susan knelt beside him, her skirts rustling against the wooden floor. Together, they began sorting through the documents, unfolding each one with careful fingers. Here's the marriage certificate, Susan whispered, touching James's signature. Her eyes grew distant with memory. Eric squeezed her shoulder gently, then returned to his search. Minutes ticked by on the notary's loud clock as they worked through the pile. Wait. Eric's voice sharpened with excitement. He pulled out a thick document, its edges crisp despite the years. Look at this. Susan leaned closer, her breath catching as she read the formal text. The deed lay before them, its official seals still bright, the signatures clear and bold at the bottom. Most importantly, there was the treaty clause, written in careful legal language that bound the land under both territorial and tribal law. It's here, she breathed. It's really here. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she traced James's signature with trembling fingers. Mr. Peterson shuffled over to examine the document. Yes, I remember this now. James was particular about having it written just so, with the treaty provisions. Said it would protect the spring for everyone who needed it. He adjusted his spectacles again. This is exactly what you need. The railroad can't touch land that's bound under treaty law without going through both territorial and tribal councils. Eric helped Susan to her feet, still holding the precious deed. We should get this somewhere safe. Susan nodded, wiping her eyes. The children will be so happy. They've been so worried. They thanked Mr. Peterson and stepped out onto the boardwalk. The morning had warmed, and the street bustled with activity. Several townspeople nodded greeting, and Susan noticed their expressions had changed. No longer did they see her as just a desperate widow who'd married in haste. The discovery of the deed had restored something of her dignity. Eric's hand rested protectively at the small of her back as they walked to their wagon. The deed was safely tucked inside his coat, close to his heart. Susan found herself studying his profile as he helped her up onto the seat. His features were still weathered and stern, but something had softened in them these past days. The ride home was quiet, but it was a peaceful silence, filled with shared relief and growing warmth between them. When they pulled up to the ranch house, Tommy and Sarah came running out to meet them, their faces bright with question. "Did you find it?" Tommy called, while Sarah simply threw herself into Susan's arms. "We surely did," Eric answered, swinging down from the wagon. He pulled out the deed and showed it to them. "This here paper means nobody can take your home away. Not Holt, not the railroad, nobody." The children cheered, dancing around them in celebration. Susan watched Eric's face as he smiled at their joy. The expression transformed him, erasing years of loneliness from his features. "This calls for something special," Susan declared. She disappeared into the house and returned with a small cloth bag. "I've been saving these for a truly happy day." She opened the bag to reveal dried apple slices, sprinkled with precious cinnamon. The children's eyes grew wide at the rare treat. "Mama Susan's special apple rings!" Sarah exclaimed, while Tommy reached eagerly for his share. They sat together on the porch steps, savoring the sweet fruit while the afternoon sun warmed them. Eric watched the children licking cinnamon from their fingers, something tight in his chest unwinding at their innocent pleasure. Susan offered him an apple slice, and their fingers brushed as he took it. The touch sent a flutter through her that had nothing to do with relief over the deed. As evening approached, the children helped with chores, their spirits still high from the day's victory. After supper, they went to bed without protest, tired but happy. Susan sat at the kitchen table, carefully copying out the deed's details in her journal by lamplight. Eric watched her from his place by the fire, seeing how the golden light softened her features and caught amber highlights in her hair. "Susan," he said quietly. She looked up, setting down her pen. "Yes?" "Been thinking about all this?" He gestured vaguely at the space between them. "About how we came to be here." Susan's heart quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "What thoughts have you had?" Eric stood and moved to the table, settling into the chair beside her. The lamplight cast his shadow large against the wall. "When you called out to me in that saloon, I reckoned it was just desperation talking. Thought maybe the good Lord was giving me a chance to help someone in need, make up for some of my failures." He paused, his rough fingers tracing patterns on the wooden tabletop. "But these past days, watching you with the children, seeing your strength and faith, well, I'm starting to think maybe God had bigger plans than just survival." Susan's breath caught in her throat. She looked up to find Eric's eyes on her, warm and intent in the lamplight. "What kind of plans?" she whispered. "The kind that take a lonely mountain man and show him there's more to life than just getting by." His hand moved closer to hers on the table. "The kind that might turn a marriage of necessity into something real, if we're willing to let it grow." Susan's fingers trembled as they met his. "I've been afraid to hope for that," she admitted softly. "I know." Eric's thumb brushed gently over her knuckles. "Been afraid myself. But maybe it's time we both had faith in more than just paper deeds and legal claims." Their eyes held in the gentle lamplight, and Susan saw in Eric's gaze the same tender hope that bloomed in her own heart. Not the desperate clutching of that first night in the saloon, but something new and fragile and sweet, like the first wildflowers after winter's thaw. The lamp flickered, sending shadows dancing across their joined hands. Outside, a nightbird called softly, and the spring burbled its endless song. Inside, two hearts that had known loss and loneliness began to recognize the possibility of something more, something born of necessity, but growing toward love. The night lay thick and heavy over the ranch. Stars glittered coldly above as a chill wind whispered through the grass. Inside the house, Eric stirred from his bedroll near the door, some sixth sense pulling him from sleep. He listened intently, years of mountain living having honed his instincts. There, a soft crunch of boots on gravel, too careful to be innocent. Multiple sets of footsteps, trying to move quietly in the darkness. Eric rose silently, rifle already in hand. The floorboards didn't dare creak beneath his practiced step as he moved to wake Susan. She came alert instantly at his touch, eyes widening at his gesture for silence. A whiff of smoke drifted through the window, not wood smoke from a cooking fire. This was darker, more sinister. Eric's heart stopped as he realized where it was coming from. "The barn," he whispered urgently. "The children." Susan was already moving, nightgown swishing as she rushed to the window. Horror dawned on her face as she saw the first orange tongues of flame licking up the barn's wooden walls. "No!" she gasped. Tommy and Sarah, they were sleeping in the hayloft. They had made beds for the children up there, where it was cooler on summer nights. Now that decision might cost their lives. Eric grabbed her arm as she started for the door. "There's men out there, Holt's riders. Stay behind me." They burst out onto the porch together, Susan clutching Eric's shirt. The night had transformed into a scene from hell. Flames roared up the side of the barn, painting everything in savage orange light. Smoke billowed thick and black against the stars. From inside came the sounds that would haunt their nightmares, children screaming in terror. "Mama Susan, help us!" Eric didn't hesitate. He charged toward the barn, Susan right behind him. Gunshots cracked through the night, kicking up dirt at their feet. But they didn't stop running. The barn door was already burning when they reached it. Eric kicked it open, splintering the wood. Heat blasted their faces as smoke poured out. "Tommy! Sarah!" Susan's voice cracked with desperation. "Up here!" Tommy's answer came from above, followed by Sarah's frightened sobbing. Eric grabbed a horse blanket from a hook, soaking it quickly in the water trough. "Cover your face," he ordered Susan, then plunged into the inferno. The smoke was suffocating, even through the wet cloth. Flames crawled up the walls like living things, consuming the dry wood. The ladder to the hayloft was already starting to burn. Eric went up first, testing each rung. The wood creaked ominously under his weight. Susan followed, coughing but determined. They found the children huddled together in the far corner of the loft. Sarah's face was streaked with tears and soot, while Tommy tried to be brave despite his trembling. "Come on!" Eric scooped up Sarah while Susan grabbed Tommy's hand. "Keep low, under the smoke!" The journey down was a nightmare. Burning hay rained around them, each breath scorching their lungs. A beam crashed down behind them, showering sparks. Sarah screamed and buried her face in Eric's chest. They stumbled out into the night air just as the loft collapsed behind them. Susan pulled Tommy clear of the falling debris, while Eric shielded Sarah with his body. They didn't stop running until they reached the relative safety of the yard. Eric set Sarah down gently. She immediately threw herself into Susan's arms, sobbing. Tommy joined them, his usual bravado cracked by fear. "Shh, you're safe now," Susan soothed, though her own voice shook. "You're safe." Eric stood guard over his family, rifle ready. He could see shapes moving in the darkness beyond the firelight, Holt's men, watching their handiwork. The message was clear. This was just a taste of what they could do. "The deed!" Susan gasped suddenly. "It's in the house?" But even as she spoke, a rider burst from the shadows, waving a familiar paper. The treaty deed fluttered in the firelight like a wounded bird. Others emerged behind him, laughing. "Looking for this, Mrs. McGraw." The voice was cruel with triumph. "Or should we say Mrs.? Cut her now." Eric's rifle came up, but there were too many of them, all armed. They wheeled their horses, disappearing into the night with their prize. Their laughter drifted back, mixing with the crackle of flames. The barn was beyond saving now. They could only watch as the fire consumed it, taking with it their hay, their tools, and their proof of ownership. The heat dried their tears before they could fall. Sarah whimpered, pressing closer to Susan. "What are we going to do?" Susan tried to answer, but no words came. The weight of their loss crashed over her like a wave, stealing her breath. The deed was gone. Their protection, their future, their hope, all gone up in smoke. Her legs gave out, and she sank to her knees in the dirt. Eric caught her before she could fall completely, gathering her and the children into his arms. She pressed her face into his chest, finally letting the tears come. "It's all lost," she whispered brokenly. "Everything we fought for." Eric held her tighter, his jaw clenched as he watched their barn burn. The children huddled against them, small hands clutching their clothes. Together, they formed a knot of grief and fear in the face of destruction. The fire painted their faces in harsh light and shadow as Susan wept. Her tears soaked Eric's shirt, each sob tearing at his heart. He had promised to protect them, and he had failed. The deed was gone, and with it their legal claim to the land. The barn's roof collapsed with a thunderous crash, sending a fountain of sparks toward the uncaring stars. The sound seemed to echo their own broken hopes, a final punctuation to their defeat. Sarah's small voice quavered in the darkness. Are they going to take our home away now? Susan couldn't answer through her tears. She just held her children closer, her body shaking with grief and exhaustion. The night that had started with such promise now lay in ashes around them. Eric stroked Susan's hair, his rough hands gentle despite their trembling. He wanted to offer comfort, to promise that everything would be all right. But the words stuck in his throat. The truth was too raw, too painful. They stayed there together as the fire slowly died, leaving only glowing embers where their hopes had stood. The pre-dawn air grew colder, but none of them moved. Moving would mean facing what came next, and right now, that future seemed darker than the night around them. Tommy's voice was small but determined. We still have each other. Susan raised her tear-stained face from Eric's chest, looking at her brave boy. Even now he tried to be strong. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks as she pulled him close. Yes, she whispered. We do. But as she met Eric's eyes over the children's heads, she saw her own fear reflected there. Having each other might not be enough against the forces arrayed against them. Without the deed, without proof of their claim, what chance did they have? The first pale light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, revealing the full extent of the destruction. The barn was nothing but a smoking ruin, black against the lightening sky. Susan closed her eyes, unable to bear the sight. In Eric's arms, she wept for all they had lost, not just the barn and the deed, but the brief, precious hope they had dared to nurture. The dream of building something real from their marriage of convenience now seemed as insubstantial as the smoke drifting away on the morning breeze. The sun would rise soon, bringing with it a new day. But for now, in the gray space between night and dawn, they clung to each other in shared grief, surrounded by the ashes of their shattered hopes. The first rays of sunlight painted the mountains gold, but they brought little warmth to the devastated family. Eric stood in the yard, studying the still smoking remains of the barn. His jaw was set in a hard line as he checked his rifle and gathered supplies. You can't go alone, Susan protested, her voice hoarse from the night's smoke and tears. Holt's men will kill you. I ain't going alone, Eric replied quietly. He adjusted the leather strap of his canteen, his movements deliberate and controlled. Henry knows these hills better than any man. He'll guide me to their camp. As if summoned by his name, Henry appeared on horseback at the edge of their property. He dismounted with fluid grace, his moccasins silent on the packed earth. His dark eyes took in the destruction, noting every detail. They went north, Henry said simply, to the canyon camp. I found their trail. Susan wrapped her arms around herself, fighting back fresh tears. The children and I will stay with the preacher's wife in town. But Eric. She touched his arm, her fingers trembling. Please be careful. Eric's weathered face softened as he looked at her. I gave you my word when we married. Maybe it started as necessity, but now, he paused, struggling to find the right words. Now it's more than that. The children ran out from the house, faces still smudged with yesterday's soot. Sarah flung herself at Eric's legs while Tommy tried to maintain his dignity, though his lip quivered. You'll come back? Sarah's voice was small and frightened. Eric knelt down, putting himself at eye level with the girl. Count on it, little one. You mind your Mama Susan now, you hear? Tommy stepped forward, his chin lifted. I'll protect them while you're gone. I know you will, son. Eric's rough hand rested briefly on the boy's shoulder. The word son hung in the air between them, new and significant. Henry waited patiently by the horses, giving the family their moment. When Eric finally mounted up, the tracker merely nodded and turned his horse north. They rode out together, two figures growing smaller against the rising sun. Susan watched until they disappeared, then gathered the children close. "Come on now, we've got work to do in town." The main street was already bustling when they arrived. Susan felt the weight of stares and whispers as she made her way to the general store. Some turned away, avoiding her eyes. Others watched with undisguised curiosity. "Did you hear?" one woman whispered too loudly. "The barn burned right down. Those poor children." "That's what comes of such a hasty marriage," another replied. No good can come from letting Holt steal what belongs to all of us," Susan interrupted, her voice carrying clear and strong. She hadn't planned to speak, but suddenly the words poured out. "That spring on my land? It feeds every creek that waters your gardens, every stream your cattle drink from." People stopped to listen. The preacher emerged from his study, and the blacksmith set down his hammer. "If Holt takes my land, he controls the water. Every one of you will have to pay his price or watch your crops wither." Susan's hands were shaking, but her voice remained steady. "Is that the future you want for your children?" A murmur ran through the gathering crowd. The blacksmith stepped forward, wiping his hands on his leather apron. "The widow speaks truth," he said gruffly. "That spring's been free water since first settlement. My grandmother drew from it." "But Holt's men," someone began. "Are just men," Susan finished. "No more than that. While my husband and Henry track down our stolen deed, we need to stand together. Show Holt that this town won't be bullied." The preacher cleared his throat. "The Lord helps those who help themselves." And their neighbors. More voices joined in, some hesitant, others stronger. Not everyone stepped forward. Some hurried away, faces averted, but enough remained. The blacksmith offered to repair their tools for free. The general store owner promised credit for supplies. The preacher's wife opened her home to Susan and the children. "We'll need to organize watches," the blacksmith said. "Keep an eye on the spring, make sure Holt's men don't try anything while your man's away." Susan's heart swelled at the words. "Your man." Yes, Eric was that now, in truth as well as law. The thought gave her strength. Throughout the day, she moved through town with purpose. The children stayed close, helping where they could. Tommy carried messages between the volunteers, organizing the watch. Sarah helped the preacher's wife prepare food for the men who would stand guard. But as evening approached, Susan's brave face began to crack. She gathered the children for supper at the preacher's house, though none of them had much appetite. "Time for prayers," she said softly when the meal was done. They knelt together beside the borrowed bed. Sarah's small hand slipped into hers as they bowed their heads. "Dear Lord," Susan began, her voice wavering, "watch over Eric and Henry as they ride. Guide them safely through darkness and danger. Protect them from those who would do harm." "And bring them home," Tommy added quietly. "And bring them home," Susan echoed. "Amen." Sarah's voice was sleepy. "Mama Susan? Do you love Eric now? For real?" Susan smoothed the girl's hair, considering her answer carefully. "I'm learning to," she said finally. "God works in mysterious ways, bringing people together. Sometimes what starts as necessity becomes something beautiful." "Like a flower growing through rocks," Sarah murmured, drifting off to sleep. "Yes, precious girl. Just like that." After the children were asleep, Susan stood at the window, staring north toward the canyon where Eric and Henry had gone. Somewhere in that darkness, her husband was risking his life to save their future. The thought that she might lose him, just as she was beginning to truly care for him, made her heart ache. But she couldn't dwell on fear. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new needs for leadership. The town had begun to rally, but holding them together would take constant effort. Some still wavered, and Holt's influence ran deep. Susan touched the simple ring on her finger, remembering the hasty ceremony that had started all this. How different it felt now, just days later. What had begun as desperate survival had grown into something real, fragile yet precious, like spring's first blossom. "Come back to us," she whispered into the night. "Come back to me." The stars wheeled overhead, silent witnesses to her vigil. In the distance, a coyote called, its lonely voice echoing off the canyon walls. Somewhere out there, 2 riders moved through darkness, carrying her hopes with them. Susan finally turned from the window and lay down beside the sleeping children. Tomorrow would require all her strength, all her courage. But tonight, she could only wait and pray and hold on to hope. The deed was stolen, but something stronger had grown in its place, the beginnings of real love and a community's awakening spirit. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Moonlight spilled across the canyon walls like silver water. Eric and Henry crouched behind a stand of juniper, watching the flicker of campfires below. The night air carried voices and the stamp of horses. 6 men, Henry whispered, his keen eyes scanning the camp. 2 by the main fire, 3 sleeping, 1 guard walking the perimeter. Eric nodded, feeling the weight of his rifle across his back. And Holt? In the tent, the one with the lantern. Henry pointed to a canvas shelter set apart from the others. Papers will be with him. They waited, patient as the stones around them, until the guard passed their position. Henry touched Eric's arm and gestured, time to move. Like shadows, they slipped down the rocky slope. The camp lay in a natural bowl, ringed by steep walls. Moonlight caught the metal gleam of rifles propped against saddles. Eric's boots made no sound on the sandy ground as they crept closer. A horse nickered softly. One of the men by the fire stood, stretching. "Reckon I'll make my rounds." Eric and Henry froze, pressing against cold rock. The man walked past, tobacco smoke trailing behind him. When his footsteps faded, they moved again. They were halfway to Holt's tent when a shout split the night. "Riders! In the camp!" The peaceful night erupted into chaos. Men scrambled for weapons. Henry rolled behind a boulder as bullets sparked off stone. Eric dove for cover, hearing the whistle of lead past his ear. "Come out slow!" someone yelled. "You're surrounded!" Eric's finger rested on his rifle's trigger. He could see 3 men silhouetted against firelight. Easy targets. The old soldier in him knew how to end this quickly, permanently. But Susan's face flashed in his mind. The children. The preacher's words about mercy. He had spent too many years dealing death. "We just want the deed!" Eric called out. "No one needs to die tonight!" Harsh laughter answered him. More shots rang out, closer now. Henry's voice came soft but urgent. "They are flanking us. We must move." Eric nodded. "Cover me." He burst from cover, not toward the tent but toward the nearest shooter. The man's eyes widened in surprise as Eric's huge frame slammed into him. They went down together, rifle flying away. Eric's fist connected once, and the man went limp. Henry appeared like a ghost, wrestling another man to the ground. Instead of killing blows, they used their strength to subdue, to disable without destroying. One by one, the Baron's men fell to fists and rifle butts rather than bullets. In minutes, it was over. 4 men lay unconscious. The 5th had surrendered, hands raised. Eric used leather straps from their own saddles to bind them securely. Only Holt remained in his tent. Eric approached slowly, hearing movement inside. "It's over, Holt," he called. "Come out." The tent flap whipped back. Holt stood there, a derringer aimed at Eric's chest. His fine coat was wrinkled, his careful facade cracked. "You're a fool, Cutter," he sneered. "You could have killed them all." Taken everything. That's how the West was won, by men strong enough to take what they want. Eric stood straight, unafraid. No, it was won by men and women strong enough to build something together. To share God's bounty, not hoard it. Pretty words. Holt's finger tightened on the trigger. But words don't water cattle. Neither does greed. Eric's voice was calm. It's finished. The deed is here somewhere. The law will stand. Something in Eric's steady gaze made Holt hesitate. This was not the wild mountain man he had expected. This was someone different, someone unshakable. The law, Holt spat. The law is whatever men make it. Not anymore. Eric took a step forward. Times are changing. The frontier's closing. Men like you, men who rule by fear, your day is done. The derringer wavered. In that moment of uncertainty, Henry appeared behind Holt like a shadow. One swift strike, and the Baron crumpled. Inside the tent, they found the deed in Holt's saddlebags, along with other stolen papers. Eric carefully tucked them into his shirt. They left the men bound but sheltered, with water within reach. Dawn was touching the canyon rim as they rode out, their horses' hooves kicking up small storms of dust. You chose a harder path tonight, Henry said as they rode. Many would have killed. Eric watched the sun rise, painting the sky in colors that reminded him of Sarah's hair ribbons. I've seen enough killing. Maybe it's time to build something instead. They rode on as morning bloomed across the land, carrying hope and justice back to those who waited. Eric was weary, but at peace. For the first time in years, he felt clean inside, as if mercy had washed away old stains. The town lay ahead. And with it, Susan and the children. Family. Future. A chance to be more than survival had demanded. The morning sun streamed through the church windows as Eric and Susan stood before the preacher. Their faces showed the weariness of their ordeal, but hope flickered in their eyes. The two children pressed close to Susan's skirts, watching with wide eyes. The Lord works in mysterious ways, the preacher said, reaching beneath the church's ancient pulpit. From a hidden compartment, he withdrew a leather folder, yellowed with age. Years ago, your husband asked me to keep this safe, Susan. A copy of the deed, made under my witness. Susan's hands trembled as she took the document. All this time. Sometimes faith gives us what we need, when we need it most, the preacher smiled gently. Word spread quickly through the town. By noon, a crowd had gathered outside the sheriff's office where Holt was being held. The Baron emerged, his fine clothes dusty, his arrogance shattered. Jeers and shouts followed him as he mounted his horse. "Get on out of here, Holt!" someone yelled. Others took up the cry. Holt's face twisted with rage and shame. Without a word, he spurred his horse hard, galloping out of town as the dust swirled behind him. One by one, townspeople approached Susan and Eric. The blacksmith offered to help rebuild their barn. The general store owner promised credit for supplies. Wives brought covered dishes and words of support. The community that had stood silent in fear now found its voice in unity. That evening, Susan lit the oil lamp in their kitchen. The warm glow caught the shine in the children's eyes as they sat around the table. For the first time, there were no shadows in the corners, no listening for hoofbeats in the night. Eric carved the roast chicken someone had brought, passing plates with gentle care. The children chattered about their day, no longer watching the windows. Susan's shoulders had lost their defensive hunch, and she smiled more freely. "Thank you," she said softly to Eric as they cleared the dishes together. "Not just for saving the land, but for showing us all what real strength looks like." He ducked his head, humble in victory. "Reckon we all learned something about strength these past days." The lamp burned steady and bright as they settled into their evening routine, a family beginning to heal, a home becoming whole. The morning sun painted the ranch in golden light. Dew sparkled on the grass as the children raced across the yard, their laughter carried on the gentle breeze. Eric knelt in the soft earth, His weathered face softened with emotion as the little ones circled around him. "I promise to be the father you deserve," he said, his voice thick with feeling. "To protect you, guide you, and love you all the days God gives me." Susan stood nearby, watching the scene with tears in her eyes. Gone was the desperate widow who had burst into the saloon that fateful night. In her place stood a woman transformed by faith and love, her face radiant with joy. The sound of wagon wheels announced the arrival of their neighbors. Tools clinked, and voices called out greetings as folks gathered to help rebuild the burned barn. Eric rose and drew Susan into his arms. "Midnight passed," she whispered against his chest. "God gave us a lifetime." The preacher raised his hands, and voices lifted in song. The hymn rose sweet and clear under the vast Colorado sky as the community joined together. "Amazing Grace" floated across the morning air, a testament to their shared faith and unity. Standing in the circle of Eric's arms, surrounded by their children and neighbors, Susan felt her heart overflow with gratitude. Their journey as a family was just beginning, built on the foundations of hope, faith, and love. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.